Hello and welcome to another virtual CAPTA meeting. This week we have Wim Decorte, Senior Technical Architect at Soliant Consulting, presenting Don't Call Us, We'll Call You, FileMaker and Webhooks. Go ahead, Wim.
This is going to be a somewhat similar presentation than the one that I did for Engage, except for the Engage one, it was heavy on the slides and the theory. We'll go through some of that today as well, but what I really want to focus on is some of the practical examples to really drive home the point as to how it works and why we'd want to use it. The why is going to be in the story through the slides, so let's get going on those. So what we're talking about here is that we have two systems. We have our FileMaker system and some other system. And FileMaker needs some data from the other system, right? So this is about integrations like webhooks are, and we will all be asked to do a lot more integrations than we have in the past. So this talks to how you want to do it. And typically, as FileMaker developers, the way that we approach this is obviously FileMaker centric, in the sense that we will construct something on the FileMaker side so that FileMaker will reach out to the other system and say, hey, do you have data for me? And depending on the frequency in which the other system generates its data and the frequency by which you call on the other system, many of your calls will be for naught, right? You'll be wasting resources asking over and over again whether the other system has data. Once in a while, you'll get lucky, and there is data that you'll get, but most of the time, and again, depending on the frequency, you'll get nothing back because there's nothing there. And obviously, you'll have to make a decision there. If you call, say, every minute, and again, depending on how often and how much data is generated on the other system, if you call very often, then obviously that increases the chance that you'll be asking for no good reason because there is no data. If you don't ask often enough, then the price you'll have to pay is that you work with stale data, right? If you only ask once every hour, chances are that you'll be working or receiving data that is just about an hour old. So you'll have to wait and see whether that would work for you. Now, and again, this is very FileMaker centric because we solve the problem from inside FileMaker. If you just have one system to integrate with, that's sort of fine. But if you have multiple systems that you need to integrate with that, it becomes a burden, a heavy burden on your FileMaker system, right? Because you'll have to find ways in your server-side schedule or wherever you want to do this to make all these calls to these other systems. It may become hard to find a good time during the day or night to do something else, like any other data cleanup or data transformation that you want to do. But also, if we look at it from the perspective of the other systems, the other system is not going to like it very much if you keep asking and it has nothing for you, or even if it has something for you, right? If the other system has 100 clients, 10,000 clients, 100,000 clients, and they all do this kind of polling where they will call and ask, do you have data? Do you have data? It's a very big burden on their system as well, right? Because they'll have to scale their system to be able to answer all those calls. And if many of those calls are for no good reason because there's no data, that's a heavy expense that they need to bear and able to care for that. And that's one of the reasons that you'll find that many of the APIs that you integrate with have throttles, right? So they will only let you make, I don't know, 500 calls an hour or 500 calls a second if it's a really scalable system, right? So when you think about calling the other system over and over again, you may not hit their thresholds that they have, but they will have thresholds. So that's something to keep in mind. So what is the alternative? The alternative is to not ask for the data, but basically wait for the data to come in. So we have our two systems, and they're both doing their own thing. And an event happens in the other system. And the event has some data that needs to be sent to FileMaker. So it just does that. It sends the data over. And if it's required, FileMaker server can reply, or your FileMaker solution can reply with an acknowledgement to say that we have received the data. And after that, the two systems go back to their old state. They both mind their own business, and that's how it should be. So there's no wasted effort in all of this. If an event happens at the other system, the data is sent, and that's it. Nothing more happens. The big benefit of that too, except for being extremely efficient on resources is that it's real time. When the event happens on the other system, you will get the data immediately. So that's as good as it gets. So about, I would say almost 15 years ago, the notion of webhooks was coined as a solution to this particular way of integrating between the two systems, right? So it's a fairly long definition there. So here's the short version, and that's why we chose it as the topic or the name for this particular presentation. If we go back to the presentation, or sorry, to the official definition there, there's a couple of things that we can look at that are of note, and one of them is the name, right? Webhook is probably the name that you'll find out there the most, but often you'll hear them referred to as callbacks. And there's a third way of a third definition for that, and it's called a push API. So webhooks, callbacks, push API. That's typically the name that you'll find for this mechanism. The other thing that is important is that it describes how that data will flow between two systems, right? It's going to be through HTTP, and it's going to be a post request because obviously it contains data. So you need to find a mechanism within that HTTP protocol that can send over potentially a lot of data, which is an HTTP post. All right, so if we go back and we look at both of our systems that we have, the one that is the FileMaker system and the other system that needs to send us some data, the way that it works is that over on the FileMaker side, we need to generate a URL, right? And then we have to take that URL and register it with the other system so that the other system knows that if an event happens and the other system expresses that event in its data, which is very often going to be JSON these days, they need to have a place to send that data to, which is the URL that we will give it, right? So in essence, that's how it works, and FileMaker can then receive that data and ingest it and work with it. So this is the basic concept of how a webhook works, so now it really comes down to can we receive the data, right? If the other system sends us some data, is there a mechanism in place on the FileMaker side that we can use to receive that data? And you would think that there is, right? Because we have the data API, and the data API is a RESTful API. It can give us a URL like the one that we see there on the screen. That's the URL for creating a record, and it supports HTTPS post. So you think that we're in good shape. We can give the other system a URL, and FileMaker server is already set up to receive data there, and we should be good to go. Well, not quite, right? Because the way that the data API works is that in order to send something to that URL, we have to be already authenticated. Because as part of the request to create a record or update a record for that matter, we have to include in the headers, we have to include a token. You can only get that token by first making a call to the data API to authenticate. Basically username and password. Once you authenticate, you'll get a token, and then you can use the token. So in order to use the data API process, it's a two-step process. Systems like the other system that uses webhook, they don't do two-step processes, right? All they want is one URL where they can send data to. So that's one problem that we will need to solve. The second problem is that we need to be able to understand the data that we are receiving. The FileMaker data API is JSON, right? But it's a very particular JSON grammar or JSON dialect, if you will, right? So the JSON that we look at there on the screen that's how Microsoft expresses data about a meeting request. If you have ever worked with the data API on the FileMaker side, you'll recognize that the JSON format that we see there is not the same JSON format that FileMaker server expects. So that's a second problem that we will need to overcome. We'll need to transform whatever we receive, like this JSON, into the JSON that FileMaker data API understands. And obviously, God forbid that we have to integrate with a system that still sends XML. And there's still a good number of systems out there that you'll find yourself integrating with that don't use JSON, right? That use XML instead. And there too, if we if our intent is to push data into FileMaker to the data API, we'll have to transform not only between different flavors of JSON, but in this case between XML and JSON. So that's something that we'll need to overcome. So if we look at what we do have available on the FileMaker side, and this applies to both FileMaker Server, the on-premise version, or whether you self-host in the cloud. It also applies to the FileMaker Cloud, the Claris FileMaker Cloud products. So there's no real functional difference between the two for what we're talking about today. So we talked about the data API, right? That seems to be the most logical candidate for getting this done. But we also certainly still have the XML API. That one has been around for a while, and it really works in exactly the same fashion, right? You can use a URL, which is one of the prerequisites for a webhook, and you can send it data. So that sort of feels like it would work. And obviously, it doesn't work with JSON because the XML API only understands the FileMaker-specific flavor of or grammar of XML. So we would have the same problem as with the data API. And obviously, on top of that, the XML API is not going to receive much love anymore from Claris, right? It's on the way out. It's going to be around for a long, long time. So if you have existing integrations with the XML API, I wouldn't worry about it going away anytime soon. But it's not going to be developed further, right? So all of the engineering effort on the Claris side is going to be in the data API and not in the XML API. So for that reason, if I had to start something from scratch today, I wouldn't consider the XML API. And then we have the ODBC and JDBC interface on the FileMaker server side. And I have it there as strike-through because of the definition of a webhook, right? The definition of a webhook mechanism by which a webhook works is to an HTTP request, and it has to be a POST request. ODBC and JDBC doesn't work that way, so that rules that one out. And we have our two problems that we need to overcome. One is how do we deal with the authentication, the two-step process that the data API requires, and then there's the format of the data that we need to worry about. So clearly, there are some things that we'll have to do in order to make it work, right? It doesn't quite work out of the box as you might expect. So this is how we wanted it to work, right? The other system has an event, sends the data, we give it a URL, and away we go. Well, we know that that doesn't work, so we'll have to put something in the middle between the two systems, so that and it has to be something that can generate a URL for us, right? Because the URL is still the thing that we have to give to the other system so that it knows where to send its data. And then when it has its event and it generates the data around that event, it sends it over to that thing in the middle that we will set up. That thing in the middle will then transform the data into whatever the data API requires and make the request to the data API so that that whole point works. Now, because we put something in the middle, and because the other system will only talk to our thing in the middle, right? Our other system will not talk to FileMaker Server directly. It'll talk to that whatever we put in the middle. It really frees us up from the communication between that thing in the middle and the FileMaker Server can really be anything we want. And obviously, you would think data API because it's the logical choice, but you could certainly do ODBC and JDBC again at that point, right? Because it doesn't really matter what you use to talk to FileMaker Server because you have full control over how you do that. But for now, we'll stick with the data API. In the whole FileMaker, or I should say the whole Claris ecosphere, that thing in the middle can certainly be Claris Connect, right? That is what Claris Connect is all about. And I'll actually show you how to use some of that. Not the standard connectors will focus on the webhook functionality, but Claris Connect is something that you could consider as something in the middle, right? And obviously the list of connectors that Claris Connect has, you can look at those as the pre-built webhooks, right? So the one that they have for Shopify, the one that they have for Gmail API, for the Outlook APIs, for SurveyMonkey, all of that stuff is basically what Claris Connect gives the other system is exactly that under the hood, right? They generate a URL that they register with the other system so that the other system can send data to Claris Connect. And then from once the data is in Claris Connect, you as a developer can then route data, transform it whichever way you want, including sending it to FileMaker Server. Right? But what if you're not into Clarus Connect, right? What if Clarus Connect is not your thing? Then certainly you have options. So if we're not going to do Clarus Connect, your choices really are going to be make or buy, right? Either you buy yourself a webhook, something that can generate that URL for you, and there's plenty of services out there that will do the same thing that Clarus Connect does, right? And you see some of them on the screen there. These are all names that you know, and that market is in a lot of flux at this point, right? So everybody's trying to get into that. So it's a really interesting place to look at. All of these services basically will act as your gateway, right? So they will do the webhook stuff under the hood for you, and they can push data into FileMaker. The way that the ease with which they can push data to FileMaker Server, it kind of depends. Some of them, like Zapier, have some, or there exists, let's put it that way, some pre-built connectors, if you will, to FileMaker Server. Some of the other ones don't, and you'll have to roll your own. But this is basically you subscribing to that service so that the service can act as the gateway, the pass-through between the system that has the data and your FileMaker solution. Right? So it's really interesting. Like I said, and these do exactly the same thing as Clarus Connect, but different levels of pricing. Different levels of pricing, but also different levels of real-time. I was going to say real-timeness. I'm not sure that that's actually a word. And that is something that you may need to consider for your solutions. How important is real-time for you? Clarus Connect is real-time. Anything you do with a data API directly is going to be real-time as well. Some of these other systems have built-in delays, right, where it can take up to 15 minutes for the data that they receive to be pushed to the other, I guess, flows in that flow, right? So that's something to carefully consider, carefully to test. If real time is not important, then obviously this would not be an obstacle. But that is always an aspect to consider when you look at these services. I mentioned make or buy. So if you're not willing to subscribe to any service, really, if you said, I don't want to pay a recurring expense for that kind of functionality, I want to do something else, then it really comes down to building your own, right? And there's plenty of choices, because if we take it back to the definition of a webhook, and because it goes through HTTP, what we're talking about really is a web service. Right? That's all a webhook really is. It's a web service that listens, that is ready to receive something, and then when it receives something, it'll take some action. And the action will be do whatever that is required to push the data into FileMaker Server. So it's a web service. You'll often hear it referred to as a microservice as well. And micro meaning, for this particular thing, it can be a really tiny web service. It doesn't have to be something big. It's lightweight, and it doesn't do too many things. So it's a small web service. It's a microservice. And I said you have plenty of options when you want to build it yourself. And because it's in the web sphere, what it really means is that you can pick any web scripting technology, right? You can do PHP, you can do ASP.NET, you can do Java, you can do Python, you can do Ruby. Missing any of the big ones? I don't think so. And obviously, you can use any of the JavaScript, the server-side JavaScript ones like Node.js or potentially React, and there's a couple of other ones out there. Node.js is one of the big ones. And I will show you how easy it is to set up. Sometimes it's called scaffolding, right? So like the scaffolds that they put around the building. It's really easy to set up a Node.js-based web service, and I'll actually run you through what it takes to do that. And the reason that I personally would pick Node.js, well, let me backtrack. If I had my free reign, I'd probably do it in ASP.NET with C# because that's just what I know. But I'm getting heavily into Node.js as well, and for one really good reason. It's JavaScript, right? And we all know how important JavaScript is getting in the FileMaker space. So whatever skills you have already built up in JavaScript are things that you'll be able to use when you set up a mini web service that is based on JavaScript. The other way around works too. Whatever skills you build up creating these small Node or JavaScript-based web services, those are skills that you can then turn around and use inside your FileMaker solutions for all of the JavaScript features that we now have in FileMaker. So anything that's JavaScript-based is a really, really good fit. And also, it installs everywhere and all of that good stuff. So it's reasonably well cross-platform. So in that sense, it works really well too, right? So if I had to build something from scratch and I don't want to subscribe to anything, then Node.js would be one of my favorite choices. And the way that I typically would do that too is that I would almost certainly, I would build it in such a way that I have a little database in my web service as well. And typically I would pick something like SQLite because we're talking about a small database that doesn't really store data for a long time. But that can store whatever is being sent its way. And the big benefit for that is that I can break the connection between my thing in the middle and my FileMaker server. Right? If I need to take FileMaker server down for maintenance or FileMaker server crashes for whatever reason, or I'm in the process of updating its version, right? If I set up my thing in the middle, my microservice, so that it can receive and store data, then I'm good to go, right? Whatever the because that's the one thing with event-driven models. If the other system will only send me data when something happens on their end, it becomes somewhat unpredictable, right? Because we have no control over when those events happen on the other side. But if an event does happen, it will want to send data our way. So if we store it temporarily and we make our microservice a little intelligent in the sense that it can check whether FileMaker server is up, and if it's not, it can store it temporarily on its own small database, and then whenever FileMaker server comes back up, it can push the data into FileMaker server. So that's typically how I would craft it these days. Now, what I also want to spend some time on today is Node-RED. And Node-RED is actually, I'll show you. I don't need to explain it too much, but the Node-RED is, as the name implies, the node part of the name, it's something that is built on Node.js, right? So it'll act as a server because it has to act as a web service for this whole webhook thing to work. So it's based on Node.js. It's extremely lightweight. And that's why I meant with microservice, right? So as web services go, you don't need a big IIS server or a big Apache server. It's really lightweight. I tend to use mine, and the one that I'll use in the demo today runs on a Raspberry Pi. And if you're not familiar with a Raspberry Pi, it's a $35 computer. It runs Linux. It's about the size of your wallet, and that's sort of what it looks like. So it's extremely lightweight, and it's a lot of fun because it's a visual flow builder. If you have looked at Clarus Connect a little bit, not that it's so similar, but Clarus Connect is a visual flow builder as well, right? You log into the web page, and I'll show you in a minute there, and then you build your flow visually. Node-RED is exactly the same thing, right? So you build your flows from receiving data and exposing endpoints where other systems can send data to, and then you basically everything that you need to do with the data that you receive, including pushing it to FileMaker server, just becomes a little node block there in your visual flow, and you guide the data along to where you need to do. You can take multiple steps, you can transform the data, all of that good stuff. So it's visual, right? It doesn't really need, you don't need to have any JavaScript skills, a little bit. If you looked at my Engage video, I'm actually showing you how to, the one place where you would need to have a little bit of JavaScript skills, but they're minor, and there's almost no learning curve to them. But for the most part, you don't need JavaScript skills, is what I'm trying to say. So it's a visual builder that is a lot of fun and works extremely well. And because, well, it's a little blurry, but because we have such a great community around FileMaker, there's a whole set of nodes, if you will, building blocks that have to do specifically with FileMaker server. And those were built by Louis Lapara, who now works at Claris and does a lot of work on the Claris Connect side. But he built a lot of these things that you can just use in Node-RED and work with. So the integration with FileMaker Server is already built into it. And so that's the other good part of that. All right. So the rest of the presentation will be demo. How am I doing for time? So okay, so half an hour left. And the use case that we will use is to take some of the parts that we have talked about in leading up to this part of the presentation. Is we're going to make it difficult for ourselves, right? I'm going to pretend that we have another system that needs to send us data about books. That's sort of like what you can read in the XML, but it will send it to us in XML format, right? We know that JSON is a lot easier, but like I said, we want to make it hard on ourselves. So we have another system. It needs to send us XML. How do we deal with that? All right? And obviously that data needs to end up in FileMaker. That's the whole point of this exercise. And I will show you how to do that with Claris Connect. And I will show you how to do that with just pushing it straight into FileMaker Server. When I say Claris Connect, the end game there too is that the data ends up in FileMaker, but we'll make the side trip into Claris Connect. Claris Connect will be our thing in the middle, our web service that can receive webhooks. All right, so that's what we are going to do. Let's get that one out of the way. Phil, any burning questions that I need to tackle before we get there?
There was one question from Sully. He asked this early on, and it wasn't specific to anything you talked about, but he said that before there was a data API, he used to use just emails to like pull stuff in, but the script engine would fail silently on occasions. And he wanted to know if there'd been issues with the data API when it's supposed to run scripts that it's failing to run the scripts. Like the script engine can fail on the server sometimes.
Yeah, it's a good question. Can it fail? Yes, absolutely. Right? Have we seen deployments where it does fail? Absolutely too. FileMaker Server as a product has many processes, and the server-side scripting is one. Data API is one. If you look at the way that the data API has progressed from 17 to 18 to 19, it's become more robust and more scalable too. Certainly in 19. But like with any deployment, if you rely on something like that, you have to put the monitoring in place to make sure that it's there when you need it to, and then kick it back into gear if it's not. The way that FileMaker Server actually manages the data API process is that if it detects that it fails, it'll automatically put it back into motion. So FileMaker Server already does its own monitoring in that respect, and will fire it back up if the process fails. We've done some really significant stress testing on the data API, and it's robust. We're very happy with it. That does not mean that we're going to trust it blindly, right? If we have a critical process, we will put things in place to do our own monitoring, and we use Zabbix for that. A couple of DEF CONs ago, I did a Zabbix presentation where I actually used the data API as an example, where I would kill it so that Zabbix would detect it, and then Zabbix can put the data API process back into gear as well. And because it's its own process, you can do all of that without having to reboot the whole machine or upsetting your FileMaker users, disconnecting them. It's its own process, so you can manipulate it as its own process at the same time.
Thanks, Wim.
All right. So I mentioned Node-RED, and we're going to go there first because it's the most fun. I said Node-RED runs on my on a Raspberry Pi, and I'm making the side trip into the Linux version. So I'm actually logged into the Raspberry Pi here. I'm just showing what it is. The beauty of Node-RED is that you actually never have to get into this, right? So you don't have to have Linux skills or any beyond just setting up the Raspberry Pi. But this is just to show you what I have going here. It's a Raspberry Pi Model 3, so it's not even the latest, greatest, which is 4. And it runs Linux 9, which is a stretch, which is also not the most recent one that they have out there. So what I'm trying to show you with and actually it's a very simple, the way that Raspberry Pis works, the hard drive is really just a micro SD card. So this one has a 32 gig micro SD card going there. So it's beginning to end. If you set something like that up, it'll set you back maybe $60, and away you go. So what you have really is, let's see if I can log back out in this one. So what I have here is this is where my Node-RED, my Raspberry Pi, Node-RED runs on port 1880, as we can see. So this is what it looks like when you get to it. You log in, and in essence, you get a blank canvas. So you start building your own things, and the core premise is that we need to build a web service, right? So we need to build something that can receive something. So the first thing that we need to do actually is, let's see if I can pick one from here instead of doing that. Over on the left-hand side, let's start there. Over on the left-hand side are all the blocks that I can drag into my canvas, right? Over on the right-hand side is the configuration and debug stuff. So HTTP, because my web service will need to be able to receive an HTTP request, so I take the HTTP node and I tell it what it is. If it's a get, a post, a patch, whatever it is. Right? So webhooks require post, so I'll just pick the post. And the beauty of this is I can just name this anything. I'll call this Kafka to make it easy. All right. So with this, I now have, it's really funny if you think of it this way. If I deploy this, right, so over on the top hand side here, I say deploy, which is the equivalent of saving, right? So I just saved it to, in essence, I just saved this web service to the Raspberry Pi, and it's now active, right? I can start sending stuff to this Kafka endpoint. So when it comes to a web service, I'm done. This is a fully working web service. Obviously, it doesn't do anything, right? Because it can receive whatever I'm sending to it, but that's it. A web service typically needs to respond, right? So I'll just create a response, and I'll just be lazy, and I'll respond with 200. That's it. The 200 is the HTTP speak for everything is fine, right? So obviously, you wouldn't hard code the response code. You would basically make your response dependent on what happens, right? So did I receive what I expected to receive? You'll want to do some validation on the data. You'll probably also want to put some security in place to make sure that you only accept requests from certain IP addresses or something like that. But certainly you would want to validate the data as it comes in, so that if somebody sends you the King James Bible, that you don't want to push that into FileMaker, that kind of stuff, right? But at its core, what I have here is a fully functional web service. It can receive stuff, and it'll respond with HTTP to 200 with the response code. So if I go to, let me duplicate this one. Right, so this is my my Node-RED web service. Right, that's the address, and I created the endpoint. It's a post. I don't really need to, but that's fine. I can send this. You can see when I click send in my Postman, I got a response back from 200. And it basically just echoes whatever it was that I sent because it didn't do anything, right? But my web service works, right? And so this is as simple as it gets to setting up a web service. It really does not get easier than this. And obviously, from this point forward, it really comes down to what is it that you want to do with this. So if I take, actually I can do the same thing, but what I'll do this time is I'll pick the body. Right, so that XML that I mentioned, right? So this is the same XML that I have in my on my PowerPoint there. So what if we send it that, right? So in the body, I will just say, I'm just sending you XML at this point. And what I'll do is just to make sure that we actually can see what's going on there. Under the common ones, the catch is basically that's your error trap, right? So I can say if whatever happens, show me what happens. And the fact that this is now not connected to my flow, to my web service, but the catch-all will basically work for anything that I put on this canvas. And I can actually put many web services on the same canvas, right? So I can, if I wanted to, I can go ahead and create another web service right here and call this one, or make the endpoint Kafka2, right? Make this a post as well, and deploy. I'm good to go, right? So now I have two web services. Well, in essence, it's the same web service if you would, but I've just created two routes or endpoints into my web service, one called Kafka, one called Kafka2. But if I want to see what I received, I can come in here and I want to see my complete message. So what will happen now is if I send something to my web service, my debug, because the green stuff is a debug node, will show me on the right-hand side my complete message. So let's go ahead and try that. Right. So the same Kafka endpoints. My body, my payload is now the XML. So if I send this over, actually, did that one not work? Let's see. Oh, deploy. See if that one does it. Send it again. All right. So you can see we do get a response from the web service, right? So we know the web service works just fine. And over here on the this particular debug node has now shown us what it is that we have received from the web service, right? I can't really stress this enough. This is really as simple as it gets for building a fully functional web service. Obviously, from this point forward, we'll have to do something with that XML to transform it and push it into FileMaker Server. So the way that looks like would be something like, see if I have a good one that isn't too complex. Focus on this one here, right? Forget about the other ones for now. So this is the same, this is an endpoint, books dummy. It can receive post stuff. One of the nice things about Node-RED 2 here is I can have this inject, right? And you can see the inject flows to the same function point as the actual endpoint, the web service route, if you would. And in the inject, I can say, hey, send me something that I need to receive. So I could paste in the XML here if I wanted to, right? So that I don't have to go to Postman and keep sending it requests. I can just click this little button here to the left of the inject, and that'll fire off the flow, if you will, in Node-RED to make this all happen. So whatever I reset, and this, what's the color here? Whatever that color is, that's the color of the FileMaker nodes, right? So you'll find them here. This is the collection of FileMaker nodes that are, in essence, pre-built. These are wrappers around the data API. That's what they are under the hood, right? So I have a create record, and I have this function node, which is, in essence, a JavaScript function. And all that I'm doing here is that whatever I receive, I will transform. I will create this data node, this little piece of data. This is JavaScript, by the way, right? So when I mentioned you don't really need JavaScript skills to make Node-RED works, this is the only place where you need just a little bit of JavaScript. And it's pretty much always going to be around transforming the data that you receive into something that FileMaker can then ingest. So what I'm doing here is I'm creating a little piece of JSON, this piece here, in a JavaScript variable, and I'm working with the message payload that I received, and I'm basically just parsing it out, right? So I'm taking the title, putting in variable called, or the JSON key called title, same with price, and then I append the data JSON that I have to the payload, and I'm returning it. with returning, what it means is that when this function gets executed, the return is what gets sent to the next block in your flow, right? Which is in essence here the FileMaker one, right? And the FileMaker one really comes down. The configuration for that one really is what's the name of your server, right? That's your FileMaker server that has the data API enabled. What's the name of the file? So basically the fully qualified domain name of your server, what's the name of the file, and what are credentials into that file that are allowed inside your, it's basically your FileMaker privilege set. So what FileMaker account that has the right privilege set to use the data API can we use, right? And that's as simple as it gets to configuring your FileMaker server side of things. All right. The only other thing that you'll find here is that when it comes to sending data to FileMaker, right? So I have my client configuration. The other thing you have to do is you have to specify a layout. That's just how FileMaker works in general. XML API, data API. You always have to specify your layouts, which establishes your context for sending data, and that's where the data gets created, right? And that's about it, right? I created my web service. I'm transforming the data, I'm pushing it into FileMaker, and I'm responding back to whoever made the request with a 200. And again, this is not how you would do it. This would be a little more conditional, depending on just what happens, right? If for some reason the record create didn't work, I would basically branch this off and respond with something that the sender can then interpret and say, hey, this is something that I need to resend, or I need to look at my data, that kind of stuff. Let's look at the questions real quick. If you have any questions about the data, about Node-RED in general, what I just talked about, let me know what those are. Phil, did you keep an eye on the questions there? Anything that I need to respond to?
Yeah, there are a couple questions that just came up. So Sully asked are you storing those credentials, the data API credentials, locally on the Raspberry Pi, and can those leak out, or how are those?
Sure.
Secure.
The way that it works with Node-RED is that they do get saved in your Node-RED configuration, but they're encrypted in storage, right? Like if you came into my house and stole my Raspberry Pi, you wouldn't be able to extract the credentials from there. So that they are protected, but they are there, absolutely, right? So just like with anything, if I build an actual web service from scratch and I deploy it to Apache or IIS, you always still have to harden the machine that acts as the web service, right? Because obviously, in order for this particular flow to work and to act as a web service, it has to be accessible, right? And remember, we're talking about something that goes to the HTTPS protocol. So we're talking about port 443 to be open, unless you specify another port. But we're talking about a port being open, accessible to wherever you want to make it accessible from, right? So if it's to worldwide internet, and just about anybody needs to be able to send data your way, any port you open on any firewall is always something to worry about. So the Raspberry Pi, in essence, is my web server. So I would have to make sure that it's well protected, that it's hardened, that I keep up to date with patches and all of that good stuff.
Okay, another question from Jeff was about Node-RED itself, and does it come with those FileMaker blocks installed, or do you have to configure that or set that up yourself?
Yep, it's actually a really good point. They're called palettes, and so you basically install them from inside. If I do FileMaker, actually I forget what it's called because I already have it installed. It's FileMaker. It's Node-RED contrib FileMaker. Just like with say Node itself, with its packages or anything, pretty much anything, any web scripting technology out there that has packages, you install them from here. Is what I'm trying to get at, right? So if you want something that had to do with, I don't know, AWS, I'm sure that there's some. No, don't do that. Right, so there's plenty of packages that have to do with AWS, right? So this is how you find them and install them. So it doesn't come pre-installed, the FileMaker nodes, but this is how easy it is to find them and install them. Node-RED itself, I forgot to mention that, is open source, right? It's free. It's not proprietary. You install it for free. Um, and it's a project that came out of IBM and is still sponsored by IBM. So as open source projects goes, this is serious, right? So this is not one of these things that that is a fluke and will go away next week. It's been around for a while, and it has really good corporate sponsors.
Okay, I think that's our question, but we think that color's teal.
Yep, yep, I can get into that. All right, so um, so the takeaway from Node-RED is it's well, I consider it really fun. It's really fun to get into. You can install it on your Windows machine, your Mac, like on the Raspberry Pi if you don't want to clutter up your own working machine, but it's a lot of fun, right? And it's really as simple as it gets to gently get you into setting up your own web services and all of that good stuff. All right. Let's transition over to I mentioned that Node.js and Node-RED is based on Node.js is a really solid vehicle to create your own web services. So I want to show you briefly, and don't let this scare you because it's really, really simple. But I want to show you how easy it is to create a web service from scratch using Node.js, right? And I'm using Visual Studio Code. It's free. It's a fantastic editor. So let's do it step by step. I'm going to view my terminal. Right. So this is Mac OS, right? So nothing fancy, no Linux. This is just a Mac machine that I'm running this on. And you can see I'm in the folder users in my folder. So I need to go to documents. No. Documents, and I have a folder called GitHub. It doesn't matter that it's GitHub. That's just where I create most of these little things here. So I'll create a folder called Cafe App, and I'll go into it. All right. So I already have Node on this machine, right? So if I do Node version, I see I have version 13 of Node. I won't go into how you install Node. Basically, you just go to the Node website, you download Node and install it. It's that simple. That gives you full Node.js. So I have, this is one of the later versions of Node that I have there. So what I can do now is I can use NPM, which stands for Node Package Manager. That thing with the palettes that I just showed you in Node-RED, that's what I'm looking at here is the command line equivalent for Node, right? The package manager. And I'm going to initialize Fastify. Fastify is just one of the many frameworks to do that scaffolding, right? To set up from scratch a fully functional web service. The other big one is Express. Express is actually a really interesting one. It's a little slightly older one, but you'll find plenty of resources to do that. Fastify is one of the more modern ones, and it's all about speed, right? It's probably the single biggest or fastest Node.js framework out there for really building and setting up web services. So I'll just let that run. So what this one does now, it goes out to the internet. Basically, NPM, the package manager, has sort of like a repo full of packages, right? So I just told it to initialize Fastify. So it will go off and collect Fastify and all of the Fastify dependencies that it needs to set that one up. All right, so that's done. I will do Node Package Manager install. What I'm doing here is basically saying, look, I'm inside this folder because that's everything here is folder based. I'm inside this folder. I've initialized Fastify. In case there are any dependencies that I missed, go ahead and install them, right? So Node Package Manager install. It'll look at what was defined there in that folder through Fastify, and it'll go grab it and install them. We'll wait for that one to finish. There's something gratifying in looking at these things, right? It's supposed to be so that you can do something else while this is running, but I always find myself looking at it. It's I feel empowered. that's done. So what I'll do now is I will ask code to open. Actually, I'll do open folder from here. And this is the app the folder that we just created, Kafka app. I'll open that one up. And what we're seeing here, this structure is a fully functional web service, right? That's what Fastify did for us. The two commands that I did, the init Fastify and npm install, what they did was scaffold all of this, right? So this is a fully functional web service. And just like web services, I mentioned routes or endpoints, right? So it comes with an example endpoints. Actually, if I go back to my terminal, and I need to make sure that I'm in that right folder. Where am I? Yep, I'm still in that folder. So when I actually run this web service, if I do npm run dev, and again, Node Package Manager is the command that we're using, and it knows what to do because I'm in that folder that has a Fastify web service running right here, right? So if I run this, it'll tell me that my server is now listening on this address and this port. So if I can go there and do 127, no, 1 port 3000, and the routes was example, right? Route is the thing that comes after your server, right? So the / and then the route. I've also used endpoint for when I was talking about Node-RED, but that's what it is, right? So I have only one route in my web service. It's the example one. But if I execute it, it says this is an example, and we can see that because that's what this code does, right? So it says return. This is an example, and all the code that we're looking at here is JavaScript, right? So and again, this is where the synergies come from. That if you're new to this and you have to pick a technology to learn this, and I would say go with JavaScript, go with Node.js. I now have how long did it take me? A couple of minutes. I have a fully functional web service that's running, and I can start adding my own routes to this. And this is a get, right? So I can make this in a post or a patch or delete or whatever I need to be. So that's how easy it is to set a web service up from scratch, an actual web service that you would do all the coding for yourself. And granted, this is a little more complex, has a little, obviously, a longer learning curve than Node-RED. But in essence, what we're looking at here is exactly what Node-RED does, right? So everything that I've done now manually is what Node-RED does for you in the visual flow builder, right? So this would be the next step up, right? Node-RED is as easy as it comes. It's visual, very easy to get into. Then you can graduate to something like this, where you want to have maybe a little more control over things, or maybe you want to package this up and deploy at your client side, something like that. All right. Any questions on this? A good question there from Sully that I see there. Have I found anything that Node-RED cannot do that you can do with Node.js and Fastify? I would say yes, right? Because Node-RED obviously depends on the palettes to expose those blocks. NPM, the Node Package Manager, has way more packages than Node-RED has, right? And it's kind of easy to package what you find on NPM and make it into a Node-RED one. But yeah, absolutely. There are things, because you have more control over what you do with actual Node.js, you can do more, right? You can tweak it, you can do all of these things, but a lot of the good stuff that you can do, I wouldn't hesitate to start with Node-RED and then graduate to the next one up as you see fit. One thing that I didn't show you with Node-RED is what we're looking at here is a, let's see, do the Bitcoin stuff, right? So this is the price of a Bitcoin. This is the price of a Litecoin. We're looking at here as a fully functional website, right? And it goes off and collects the data as I want it. If I hit refresh, it'll go grab the latest data. I can change this, and it'll change and go and collect the data. All of this is is this Node-RED flow, right? So it's not only about building a UI-less web service. You can also build fully functional websites using Node-RED. So this is one of them, and this is how it looks, right? So pretty cool. If you're not into building UIs, but you want a UI for something, maybe a simple dashboard or something like that, you can use Node-RED for that stuff too. So I think that's pretty cool. All right. Any burning questions on this before I move off of that one?
Wim?
Yep.
Wim, is the website you just showed us right behind there, the Bitcoin, is that pulling the data from FileMaker? Is that?
Nope. No, that's just an example that it actually calls APIs.
Oh,
I
okay.
forget which ones it is, but it does call APIs. It just there's no FileMaker stuff in there.
Okay.
But it could just as easy, instead of these two API calls, the orange ones, it could just make calls to FileMaker, right, and
Right.
show the data in exactly the same way. I think it's pretty darn cool. For the for my Engage stuff, I have the flow that we're looking at here. Let's see if I can zoom this one out just a little bit without breaking my whole thing. All right. This flow is the fully functional flow that takes that XML and creates records in FileMaker. My FileMaker database is actually this one, right? So it's the bookstore, and it'll create records. And it's actually it's a really nice example, and I can share that. The nice thing about Node-RED is I can save this as JSON, and I give it to you, and you can just import it into your Node-RED, and away you go. So because everything in there is under the hood, it's all JSON. But this one will take apart the XML and then loop through it and create books. I don't know if you paid close attention to the XML example that I have, but one of the books has 4 authors, for instance. Right? So it's not as straightforward as creating a book record. I also have to create author records. And obviously I want to make it conditional, where I create a book, I take a look at the authors and then loop through each author. If I don't find the author, that's what I do here, right? If I find the author, I create a new join record between the author and the book. If I don't find the author, I create the author record. Then I go back and create a join record between the author and the book. So this is a very involved flow that takes apart the XML and creates all the matching FileMaker records. Nothing you couldn't do with XSLT, for instance, right? So this is just one more option. I'm just finding that XSLT is a dying art. It's a skill that I used to have. I don't have it anymore. And I'm finding that this is just as easy to put together. And the skills that I use to make this happen is all more in the web service realm. So skills that I can reuse elsewhere. All right. So Node-RED, full-blown Node.js web service. That's where we are. We're actually a little over time there. The last thing that I wanted to show you briefly was Connect. Still good to go. Probably take about 10 minutes.
Sure, go ahead.
All right. Let me log into my Clarus ID. That's fine. I can go there. It's a little slow today. All right. So Clarus Connect. The thing with Clarus Connect, and like I said, obviously, actually, let's start a new one. No, let's not start a new one. Let's look at this one. You've seen this before, right? So Clarus Connect has all of these connectors. When you look at any one connector, you'll see triggers and actions. Actions are things that you can do once the flow has already started. But triggers, that's the stuff that we talked about today, right? Triggers are the events that happen in this particular example over on the active campaign side, if an event happens on that side, they will send data to Clarus Connect, right? And under the hood, that's webhooks, right? So any of these 4 events on the active campaign side are handled by Clarus Connect, meaning that Clarus Connect will have registered a URL for each one of those at active campaign, basically in your active campaign account, to say, hey, if something happens, if that event happens, this trigger happens, send data my way. So and that's how Clarus Connect works. Now, we are mostly interested, though, in the things that are not covered by the pre-built connectors, right? What if you want to do your own stuff? That's why Clarus Connect has a webhook connector. And all I need to do here is create a new webhook. Let's call this one Kafta CC. So as soon as I give it a name, I now have a URL, and this goes back to the beginning of the presentation, right? Webhooks work this way. My system generates a URL, I give it to the other system so that the other system can then send stuff my way. So if I take this URL and I go back to Postman, let's duplicate this one. All right, and I use this one. This is the URL that we just got from Clarus Connect. Actually, this won't work. Let's see. I need no. Bear with me. I don't have anything like that. Well, that's fine. Doesn't really matter which one I'm using. Here's the thing with Clarus Connect. You have to send JSON, right? Clarus Connect out of the box does not understand XML. It can only work with anything that works with JSON. So I have this. This is JSON, and that's it. If I send that, right, I get response 200 from Clarus Connect, meaning Clarus Connect has received my request, and I can now save this trigger. If I do an action, doesn't really matter what my action is. Variable is fine. Call it Wim. No. Create a new variable. Call it Wim. Right, so by virtue of sending something to Clarus Connect, to the webhook, Clarus Connect has now learned what it is that I sent, which was fairly simple, right? So there's really not a lot there. There was a query and a limit, and you'll find those in here, right? Query and limit, right? So that is the beauty of Clarus Connect. It can act as a web service, as a webhook for anything you can send it along, really, provided that it's JSON. And it will learn the structure of the JSON that you send it. Just that's what it does, right? There's not a lot of parsing I need to do or tell it like this is the format. It'll learn by virtue of you sending it something. Now, if I go back to my premise and I want to integrate with that thing that sends me XML book information, and I want to use Clarus Connect, I can't, right? Because I just said Clarus Connect can only receive JSON. It does not receive XML. And the way that I put that together is I actually do that through Node-RED, right? So this is my web service. So this is the endpoints. Let's make it a little bigger. This is the endpoints that can receive the XML. And the only thing that I'm doing, this is a built-in function in Node-RED to say, hey, transform the XML to JSON, right? And then I send that to the endpoints, to the URL that Clarus Connect has, right? So in essence, I'm using 2 webhooks to make this happen. My Node-RED becomes a webhook to receive the XML, and I'm using the Clarus Connect webhook to then receive the JSON that I just transformed so that it can then do the rest of the flow. Obviously, you wouldn't use a construct like this unless you already had Clarus Connect, right? If you already subscribe to Clarus Connect and you want to use it for the rest of the flow, then this is a really easy way to make that happen, because there's not a lot of complexity to this, obviously. So you can just use it, easy to maintain. All right, that's about it. So that's the webhook that is built into Clarus Connect is something to keep in mind. It's really powerful. So if you are already a Clarus Connect user, that's a really great tool to have in your tool belt. All right. So to wrap things up, I've demonstrated 3 ways that you can use webhooks, right? And the reason why you would want webhooks is some other system needs to send you data, and it has to happen real time. You don't want to be polling the other system all the time. You can use Node-RED, really simple to get into, very visual, very low and very flat learning curve to get into. If you want to subscribe to something, you can subscribe to Clarus Connect. You can subscribe to Microsoft Power Automate or Zapier or any of the other ones. They'll do the same thing that Clarus Connect does. They will give you built-in integrations, or you can build your own from scratch. And if you build your own from scratch and you have no preset determined technology stack that you must use, maybe because the client mandates it, or maybe you have Java skills or Ruby skills or whatever they may be. If you don't have any of those constraints, then I would highly encourage you to look into Node.js. And that's it.
Sully asked a question about the Clarus Connect, if they keep a list of the triggers for all the connectors, and I think the answer is not really.
And your answer is correct, Phil. They do not. They maintain a public list of the connectors, but not the triggers for each connector.
You have to basically go look them all up individually to see what each one does, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. It's one of the things that we internally we kicked around, right? Where if you look at these things, you could scrape this, right? Because if you look at the HTML under the hood, it's all listed, so you can certainly scrape it and build your own list. But really, I agree that it's something that Clarus should make available so that we can easily look things up.
And I think another thing is that Clarus has dates when it was added or when it was modified, but they don't tell you what was added or modified, so you still don't really know, looking at the Clarus list, what it does.
Absolutely.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask one other question. A lot of the APIs that I work with that are outside of FileMaker, sometimes they'll ask for a response that's an XML or some other type of some other data type. Does Clarus Connect handle those requests in formats that are other than JSON, or is that something that you've worked with at all?
Yeah, like I mentioned, Clarus Connect only works with JSON, right? So if the other system sends you XML, then Clarus Connect is not your thing. Unless you do something like I just mentioned, right, where you make a little bit of a side trip where you'll say, well, I will put this in the middle so that the other system can send it to here, I'll transform it to JSON, then forward it to Clarus Connect. Obviously, you wouldn't do this if you didn't already have Clarus Connect, right? If where you are right now is making the choice between buying into Clarus Connect or going some other way, and you're faced with an integration where you will receive the XML, then I would say probably not worth getting into Clarus Connect and just use something else like maybe Node-RED or build your own.
Right. So there's one in particular. Twilio uses XML for most of its internal controls. So it actually all of the development kits that they have for it are basically they ask for a response that's in XML. So if you try to build something like a webhook into Clarus Connect, even if it's getting JSON as an input, getting an output that's in XML could be a little bit tricky. So
No, the sending is fine, right? Because once you have your data in Clarus Connect, you can construct your data any which way you want. XML is nothing more than a string of text, right?
right.
So you can certainly construct your XML in Clarus Connect and have it sent to the other system. Because the way that Clarus Connect works is obviously I've shown the webhook as a trigger, but you can use the webhook as an action, right? So I can actually get, post, or patch, put anything like that to some other system using the webhook in Clarus Connect.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you say that the XML to JSON was a built-in function on Node-RED?
Yes, it is.
That's pretty sweet.
Yeah, it is.
And it's fast too.
All right. Anybody else? Oh, here's something from Heidi. Oh, she just says it can use Twilio Triggers.
Right. That was part of my question about, do they maintain a list of triggers publicly? Like, you know, when they announced Clarus Connect, I had already started writing webhooks for Twilio for customers that I had, and I was concerned at the time that they were going to you know, do 50 different triggers, and you'd be able to do everything that I just wrote, and I'd wasted a bunch of time, and I could have just, you know, shortcut the whole thing by using Clarus Connect. But then the triggers that came through with that, right? So there's really only 3. There's SMS messages, incoming and outgoing calls, right? That's actually different than I remember. It used to be incoming and outgoing SMS messages and incoming calls. So, yeah.
It could have changed.
Right. So you know, there's a lot more that kind of goes into that with Twilio. They have all these different extra functions. There's Twiml bins and Twilio Studio, Flex, and you know, Task Router, and a million other little APIs that they use, and they keep adding more, and it seems like they can add more faster than the guys at Clarus can keep up with that one connector. So it'd be nice to have some way of just kind of subscribing to that connector, so that I can see, okay, well, there's a new function that Twilio has, that the Twilio connector has, and with that new trigger, maybe I can not have to focus on building this one extra piece. I can just use the Clarus Connect accounts that my customers already have, just to keep them going. Yeah, I mean, that was my thought.
Yep. At any opportunity that you have, keep bringing it up with the Clarus people, right? It seems like basic documentation to me as well. So I certainly keep asking for it. It'll make things easier, right? If they make this a knowledge base article and we can subscribe to changes to the knowledge base article, then we're good to go, right? Then we can be up to date and be informed.
Mm-hmm. I'll have to mention that to Louis next time I talk to him. So,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. And the other good person to talk to about that is Ronnie Rios. He used to be the last of the sales engineers, but he's now, I believe, in product management over on the Connect side.
Okay. I'll have to look him up.
Well, thank you, Wim. I don't know if anybody else has anything else they want to ask you or ask about FileMaker. We have about 8 or 9 more minutes if anybody has anything.
Yeah, anything at all.
Well, if not, Wim, I want to thank you very much for doing this presentation. It was very helpful and really showed us a lot.
Yeah, great stuff.
And
yeah,
virtual class.
nice.
Thanks, Wim. Awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
And so thank you for doing this presentation on FileMaker and webhooks. And I want to remind everybody, we'll be meeting in 2 weeks, and we'll do the FileMaker scripts that execute data API.